Good evening. Good to have you with us tonight. Let's start with prayer. Father in heaven, we do praise you and give you all the thanks for the privilege of worshiping you, the privilege of being in your house, the privilege of being called your children, to have received and understand your word. And I pray that you'd help us as we go through our study of the book of Ezekiel, that we would find it both helpful and inspiring. Help us to understand it so that we might know you better and might glorify you even more. And we give you the thanks in the name of Christ. Amen. So we continue our study tonight, having started last week. So if you like, turn in your Bibles to Ezekiel chapter 1. Now last week we covered a number of things. We looked at sort of the chronological time frame and where Ezekiel fits into God's plan of redemption. We looked at some key words and some key themes. It might have seemed a little tedious. I don't know. Maybe it was hard to go through. But I guess if you want to just take anything away from it, it's that Ezekiel has a context. And we have to keep in mind that in the covenant, we talked about this last week, remember, God has a covenant relationship. Pastor Job spoke of it even this morning. We went back to Deuteronomy and we looked at the covenant and the blessings of the covenant and the curses of the covenant. God said, you obey me and I will bless you, and if you disobey me, you will suffer these curses and I will judge you. And so we looked at Ezekiel, starting in that context, because what happened? Israel rebelled against God and they were disobedient. And so God brought judgment upon Israel, first of all, through the Assyrians, the Assyrian Empire, and then in Ezekiel's day, through the Babylonians. And so Ezekiel is in Babylon because of God's judgment upon Israel. Just as he promised, God is keeping his word. And that's one of the themes, wasn't it? That God always keeps his word. And he's a God of judgment. And so that's what's going on here while Ezekiel finds himself in Babylon. And let me just mention something here. It's kind of a side thought. When we talk about Ezekiel being in Babylon, we shouldn't think that he was, in the city proper, that he was, say, within the walls of Babylon. Now, Daniel was, right? Daniel's right in the king's court. And so there are some who are living inside of the city. But most of the exiles to Babylon are living in regions outside of the city, sort of like encampments. Sometimes they're called encampments. Little communities scattered around outside of the city, and yet it's in Babylon, isn't it? And they are under Babylon authority and rule. And so when we're told that he is among the exiles by the Kibar Canal, that would be outside of the city. The Kibar Canal was really an irrigation ditch. If you want to think of it, what it really was, it's an irrigation ditch. It's a canal that was handmade to transport water for a variety of things, but, agriculture and just for a supply of water for other purposes, but it is an irrigation ditch. And so that's where he's at. In Babylon, probably outside of the city, in an encampment, and there are a number of encampments around Babylon. So, looking at verse 1 then, in the 30th year, everyone generally understands that Ezekiel is 30 years old. He had gone to Babylon in the captivity 5 years before this. And so this is the 4th month, the 5th day of the month, as I was among the exiles by the Kibar Canal. And so if he's 30 years old, this would have been the year that he entered into the priesthood. That's when a Jewish man officially entered into. So he was in preparation for the priesthood, was taken away at age 25 up to Babylon, had been there for 5 years, and now, as a young man, he would be entering the priesthood, wouldn't he? And here he is by the Kibar Canal. We see in Psalms, we see this pitiful picture of them, sitting by the Kibar Canal, and they hang up their violins, as it were, and they say, how can we sing? How can we play? And there's just this mournful, pitiful picture of them sitting by the canal. And so he's 30 years old, and heavens were opened, and I saw visions of God. And so this tells us the whole focus of what's going on here, the focus of the vision that follows. It's a vision of God. So as we go through the details this evening, primarily this is a vision of God. And God wants Ezekiel to have this vision. And it was on the 5th day of the month, and it was the 5th year of the exile of King Jehoiakim. And we talked about that. That's the context again. The word of the Lord came to Ezekiel the priest, the son of Buzi, in the land of the Chaldeans, or the Babylonians, by the Kibar Canal, and the hand of the Lord was upon him there. So verses 1 through 3 serve as an introduction. What do we know about Ezekiel? That's pretty much it. We don't know anything about him except what we read here. So this is our introduction to Ezekiel. Young man, 30 years old, who's going to be a priest, and now the word of the Lord comes to him. And so he was preparing to be a priest, but now he becomes a prophet. And the hand of the Lord is upon him there. And so tonight we are just going to kind of make a quick journey through this first vision, or this vision, okay? And there are other visions to follow, but this opening vision, and we're just going to kind of quickly work our way through it, and at the end we'll make some application. And I want to remind you that I said we're not going verse by verse. There are a lot of details here. We could take time on some of these details, but we're not. Remember, I said it's kind of like, what's the big idea? What's the big picture here? And so that's how we are approaching it, and that's how we will look at chapter 1, beginning with verse 4. So 4 through 28, verses 4 through 28 is the vision. And then at the end of 28, he says, and that's what this likeness was. It was the glory of the Lord. So let's go through it and see God. It is a vision of God. As I looked, behold, a stormy wind came out of the north. Now that's probably an important detail because the north represented trial and tribulation because their foes, their enemies, all came out of the north. So when this vision comes out of the north, it's an ominous sign, and we know that it's a sign of coming judgment. And so a stormy wind, not a cool breeze, just a summer breeze. No, it's a stormy wind. It has stirred up, it has kicked up out of the north, and a great cloud with brightness around it and fire flashing forth continually, and in the midst of the fire, as it were, gleaming metal. So now out of the north, this ominous sign, there is a storm coming. We know that it is coming judgment, and there's brightness around it. So out of this great cloud, there's brightness around it. And he says, with fire flashing forth continually. So here's this cloud, and on the, as it were, the outer edges around it, there is what we would call lightning, the flashing of lightning. And it's continuous, flash after flash, lightning bolt, as it were, after lightning bolt, just all around this cloud. Now in the scripture, when we think of lightning and God, it speaks of two things. It can speak of the glory of God. God is powerful. God is awesome. This is a display of the power of God. We've seen that in a couple of Psalms. The lightning of God. God is powerful and awesome. And it speaks of power, but it can also be an ominous sign of the power and the authority, the greatness of God is coming, and he's coming in judgment. And so there's this great power of God on display in this cloud. In the midst, and it says, and in the midst of the fire, as it were, gleaming metal. So in the midst of this cloud, in the middle of the cloud, there is something that is like gleaming metal. Commentaries describe for us that this would be something like molten lava. You know, you have a volcano, you have molten lava spewing out of it, and we'll see a little bit later another description of it. And so it would be within this cloud, within this lightning, there is something that is like molten lava. It's this gleaming metal. And so that's the cloud. And from the midst of it came the likeness. Now, I just want to point out, we've already seen the word likeness before, and we're going to see it continuously. He keeps saying, well, it's like this. It kind of has the appearance of this. There is a likeness. He says that over and over again. Why? Because he's struggling to describe it. It's a vision, and he's struggling to describe what he is seeing. It's like this. So when we read the description here, it's like this. May not be exactly. And so there's a lot of details. You might sit and think, well, how does that work? Or how does that work? You know, what do we think of? It's a likeness, right? You can't worry about the details sometimes in some of these things. So he says that, and from the midst of it came the likeness of 4 living creatures. Now, he doesn't identify them here, but in chapters 9 and 10, he tells us that these creatures are cherubim. So there are 4 cherubim. Now, in the scriptures, the cherubim, primarily, we find them identified with the presence of God, the presence of the Lord. So that cherubim are sometimes called angels of the presence. Not presents, like Christmas presents, but presence. They are angels of the presence because they are always associated with the presence of God. We first read about cherubim in the Garden of Eden. Remember, they are the guardians after the fall. They're guardians to protect entrance into the garden so that no one can get to the tree of life. And that's their role. They're guardians. And so it's understood here that the angels are here as guardians. They're cherubim who are associated with the presence of God. And we'll see this unfold as we go through it. And so they're there as guardians of God. He goes on to say, and this was their appearance. So now it's the likeness of 4 living creatures. We find out these are cherubim, and here's their appearance. They had a human likeness. Now, Are they exactly like humans? No, but they're like humans, human likeness. But they're not like humans because each had 4 faces and each of them had 4 wings. Now, when we think of faces, he's going to circle back, okay? He just tells us about them. He circles back in a little bit to give us more detail. It isn't that they had 4 necks and each had 4 heads, right? They had 1 head and 4 faces. And so that's what he sees here. They kind of look like a human, but each one had 4 faces and each of them had 4 wings. We'll learn more about the wings in just a moment. He comes back to this. But he moves on to their legs. Their legs were straight. In other words, they weren't like human legs or animal legs that had kneecaps, and ankles. They were like a solid leg. So they're kind of human-like, but each one is straight. And their feet were like the sole of a calf's foot. Commentators differ on why calf's foot, but perhaps to symbolize stability, sure-footedness, as it were. And so you think of a calf and its hoof being very stable and sure-footed. That's the best guess anyway. So their feet were like this, like the sole of a calf's foot, and they sparkled like burnished bronze. So these creatures who had 4 faces, straight and strong legs, stable feet, there was a glow. They sparkled. There was this glow about them. They sparkled like burnished or polished bronze. Now we find out that this glow was not their own, but it was the glow of God being reflected by these creatures. So, they sparkled like burnished bronze. It was like the glow, the brilliant sparkle, brilliant brightness that was coming from God himself. And under their wings, on their 4 sides, there were human hands. So he's going to come back to describe the wings a little more, but here we find out that under the wings there were hands. So each one of them had human hands. And we wonder, why hands? Well, most speculate, and I think, there's evidence for this, that, we speak about human hands, right? And opposable thumbs, capable of skilled work, capable of doing intricate work, intricate details. And there is a place in chapter 10 and verse 7 where the hands are mentioned again. So in chapter 10, verse 7, and a cherub stretched out his hand from beneath the cherubim to the fire that was between the cherubim, and took some of it and put it into the hands of the man clothed in linen, who took it and went out. So we see here, if you're going to reach out and take a hold of a coal, you probably need something like a human hand to do that, to hand it to someone else, which is what they do. So the human hand function here, and the way human hands would, just with skill and dexterity, able to grab things and hold things and hand off things. So each one had human hands. In other words, they were very skilled. That's the idea. They were very skilled. They had dexterity to do even intricate and detailed things. And the 4 had their faces and their wings thus. Now he's going to describe this for us. Their wings touched one another. Each one of them went straight forward without turning as they went, and as for the likeness of their faces, each had a human face, and the 4 had the face of a lion on the right side, and the four had the face of an ox on the left side, and the four had the face of an eagle. So here he tells us that they each had wings. He's going to say more about this in a moment. They had wings. We find out they had 4 wings and 2 human hands. So he tells us about their faces. Each one of these cherubim had a head with 4 faces. And he said, and the 4 had a face of a man, a human face, the face of a lion on the right side, and the 4 had the face of an ox on the left side, and the 4 had the face of an eagle, which would have been on the fourth side or the back side. So what is the significance of each one of these faces? Now it would be great if there was universal agreement. If everybody agreed, then we could say, okay, well, this is exactly what it means. But there isn't. Now, I would say there's like a majority opinion. Most of the time they represent something. But then there's a few people who throw in a few odd things. And going back, to the church fathers, there were some who thought they represented Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Things like that. Those things are, those opinions are not considered, worthy. So what do they represent? Well, probably, I would say, the very simplest explanation is the best explanation here. So, the face of a man, a human face, speaks of intelligence. Human intelligence. Among God's creation, man is at the top, isn't he? And his face among God's creation would represent intelligence. They also had a face of a lion. Well, what's the face of a lion represent? Well, everybody knew because it was in the Wizard of Oz. You had the Tin Man, the Straw Man, and the lion. And what did the lion need? Courage, right? And so it's generally understood that the face of the lion represents courage or fearlessness. And so each one of these cherubim had the intelligence of a man and the courage of a lion. And then they also had the face of an ox. What's an ox represent? Probably strength, right? Strength. I mean, you could hitch a plow to an ox, right? And plow a field. You can turn a grinding wheel with an ox. And it was just, even in their culture, they understood that the ox was a symbol of strength. Now, there are other, ideas or thoughts about what an ox might represent, but I think it's very simple that they represent strength. And then they had one more face, the face of an eagle, and here they represent swiftness and mobility in flight. When you think of an eagle, the swiftness and mobility of an eagle. They soar, above the earth, as it were, into the heavens. And so each one of these cherubim had a face, and they represent human intelligence, they represent great courage and fearlessness, and they represent strength and power, and they represent swiftness of movement. And we see this in each one of these cherubim as they go out. What are cherubim? I mean, what are angels generally? They're messengers of God, right? And these angels have a particular responsibility, and it is, as we go through it, generally I think it's understood that they are guardians of the throne of God. They are guardians of God's glory, guardians of God's holiness. And so wherever the throne moves, these cherub move. And they need intelligence and courage and strength and swiftness to carry out their function. So, verse 11, such were their faces. And their wings were spread out above. Each creature had 2 wings, each of which touched the wing of another, while 2 covered their bodies. And so they have 4 wings, and with 2 they stretched them out. 2 wings, what do? They stretch them up and out, so that the tip of the wing, touched the tip of a wing of another angel or cherubim, right? So that it formed a perfect square around the throne of God. So we have, with the 2 wings, they're stretched out, touching the wings of another angel. And with 2 wings, they cover themselves. We think of the seraphim, like in Isaiah, with 6 wings. And with them, the 2 wings covered their eyes, 2 wings covered their feet, and with 2 wings they flew. Here, the 2 wings cover themselves, which speaks of the reverence before the presence of God. As it were, a kind of humility. They recognize how unworthy they are to be in the presence of God, and so they cover themselves because of the holiness, the greatness, the glory of the God that they serve. So 2 wings are spread out, and 2 they cover themselves. Verse 12, and each went straight forward. So now we're getting a picture of their movement. These angels did what? They had their wings touching, tip to tip around the throne of God and supporting the throne, as we'll see. But they moved, and each went forward, so that, if they are sent out by God, each one would go in a particular direction, right? And because they all have 4 faces, they can always go forward. And we'll see how this functions in just a moment. But each one moves forward at the voice, the command of God. And wherever the Spirit would go, they went out, without turning as they went. So you get this motion, right? They move forward and side to side, but they don't turn. It's not like they make a big swing, a big arc as they move. And we're going to find out that they move quickly, swiftly, and so they're just moving forward and backward and side to side. This square, as it were, right? Wing to wing, 4 cherubim moving straight forward, side to side, wherever the Spirit would go. Now you notice it's a small s. Some take it to be a capital S. Most say it really wouldn't matter whichever one you went with, but here it would be that they were, propelled, they were animated, the Spirit within them. However, that Spirit within them would be motivated by the command of God, right? Because they're messengers of God. They don't move on their own. They move as God directs them. But that comes from within. And so they move forward wherever the Spirit would go, without turning as they went. And as for the likeness of the living creatures, these are the cherubim, their appearance was like burning coals of fire. So now he's focusing in on their human-like bodies, so that the appearance that he got from them is that they were like burning coals of fire, like the appearance of torches moving to and fro among the living creatures. So out of their, form, out of this likeness, it's like, you can't really describe it perfect. It's like burning coals. And you know what burning coals look like, right? Takes us back to that idea at the beginning of maybe of like a lava glowing, right? And they're like burning coals maybe. And so you have these cherubim, and that's what he notices about them. They have the wings, they have the faces, and their body is just glowing like coals, bright glowing. Or you could say it's like the appearance of torches, moving to and fro among the living creatures. You take a torch, you go into the darkness and you move and you can see where they're going because of the torch, right? So he says as they move about, because of this glowing, it looks like torches moving about, forward and back, side to side, among the living creatures. And the fire was bright. It was brilliant. And out of the fire went forth lightning. So now here's this sense of lightning again. Out of this, he's trying to describe the appearance of these cherubim. Their torso, as it were, right? Glowing coals. They move around. It looks like torches moving around. And there's lightning flashing inside of them. This is brilliant, right? This is striking. This is powerful. And so, again, it speaks both of the power and authority, the might of God, but it also speaks that there is a hint of a harbinger of coming doom, of judgment. And so, again, it's the likeness of, he can't really describe it perfectly. It's just kind of what he sees. And verse 14, and the living creatures darted to and fro like the appearance of a flash of lightning. And so now we get the idea. They're swift. They can move like lightning. These 4 cherubim with wings to wings who can move to and fro, forward and back, side to side like lightning, like a lightning flash. Boom, here they are. And now they're gone, they're over there. The lightning strikes and they're over there. So it speaks of power, but it also speaks of swiftness of movement. How can we picture these cherubim, surrounding the throne, guardians of the throne and of God's movement? Well, it's like lightning. It's that fast. Again, human terms trying to describe what he's seeing and what these things represent. And so the flash of lightning speaks of quickness and just a darting of motion. And he says they dart to and fro. Now, verse 15, as I looked at the living creatures, the 4 cherubim, I mean, if that wasn't strange enough, not really get strange, right? As I looked at the living creatures, I saw a wheel on the earth beside the living creatures, one for each of the 4 of them. So not only do we have these 4 cherubim with 4 faces, touching wing to wing, but beside each one of them there was a giant wheel. It touches earth and it reaches into heaven. That's how big it is. So each one has a wheel. And it's, all 4 of them have a wheel. And they touch the earth. And as for the appearance of the wheels and their construction, their appearance was like the gleaming of beryl, meaning they were brilliant. They were bright and brilliant. And so, these are not like, bicycle wheels that are black, right? But these are wheels that have a brilliant glow about them. They shine. And the 4 had the same likeness. All 4 were like that, and their appearance and construction being, as it were, a wheel within a wheel. As it were. There's a wheel within a wheel. Now, it's not a wheel in a wheel like this. I know that you already know this, but that's a wheel. It's not like a wheel within a wheel, but if you kind of, it would be more like a wheel within a wheel, so that they are at right angles. They're perpendicular. So you have a wheel and you have another wheel inside of it. You say, well, how does that work? Well, we're not meant to think too much about the details of this, but it's a wheel within a wheel, showing that they can move in any direction. Remember, it moves forward, backward, side to side, like lightning. There are wheels that can go in any direction, forward and backward, side to side, and move quickly. But there's more to it than that. Verse 17, and they went in any of their 4 directions without turning as they went, like us turning a corner of a car or a bicycle. No, they just move straight side to side. They don't need any turning. And their rims were tall and awesome. And the rims of all 4 were full of eyes all around. So, each one of them had 2 wheels, a wheel within a wheel, so that there are 8 wheels because all 4 of them have wheels. And around them on the outside, outside it's full of eyes. Well, that's a strange sight, isn't it? And yet, I think, it's generally understood that this speaks of the omniscience of God. God sees everywhere. Wherever God moves, he sees. He sees before him, he sees behind him, he sees beside him. God sees everything. And God knows everything because he sees everything. Nothing is hid from the eyes of the Lord. And these giant wheels are meant to be symbolic of that fact. With the eyes, God sees everything from earth to heaven. God sees it all. And they move wherever God wants. And so they're full of eyes all around. And when the living creatures went, the wheels went beside them. And when the living creatures rose from the earth, the wheels rose. And wherever the Spirit wanted to go, they went. And the wheels rose along with them, for the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. And when those went, these went. And when they stood, these stood. And when they rose from the earth, the wheels rose along with them, for the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. So he's trying to describe what he sees, as much as well as he can. We get the sense he's trying hard, but it's kind of like this, kind of like that. They have the appearance of this, the appearance of that, and he sees wheels intersecting wheels with eyes all around, and each angel has a wheel within a wheel, and the spirit that is moving the angels is also moving the wheels. So that the spirit in the creatures is also in the wheel, so that they are in unison, in harmony of motion, aren't they? Harmony of motion. And then over the heads of the living creatures, there was the likeness of an expanse, shining like awe-inspiring crystals spread out above their heads. And so we have these creatures. Their wings are spread out. 2 of them are spread out. 2 of them, they're covering themselves. They have the wheel within a wheel. We see them moving about with lightning-like speed, moving in harmony, moving in unison as they carry out the will of God and as they move with the throne of God. And above them, then, there is an expanse. Now, again, what does that mean? Well, some translations say firmament. Ours says an expanse. Taken from the Hebrew word, it gives the sense of, what would I say, a pounded out metal. Okay? So that some, like D.A. Carson, says that it would have been sort of bowl-shaped, kind of like an upside down or inverted bowl. He calls it like a Chinese wok, so that it'd be sort of a bowl shaped above them, very large, shining metal. Others question that and say probably just a large sheet of metal. That's what it looked like, of hammered out metal. And of course, in those days, if they wanted to pound metal into a shape, they literally pounded it, didn't they? Heat it up and pound it. And so that's kind of the idea here. Whether it was bowl-shaped or flat, I don't know. I don't think it really matters. But above their heads, there was what looked like an expanse, shiny, like awe-inspiring crystal spread out over their heads. Now, the word crystal here, again, it could mean something else. If you look into the Hebrew word and then go to the book of Revelation, it might be that he's saying he sees something that looks like a giant sheet of ice, like crystal. And so many commentators think that's what he sees. What looks like a giant sheet of ice. It's because of the glory and the brightness of God, it glows, it shines. You light up ice and it's brilliant in color, isn't it? And so he sees something up there that's brilliant, it's bright, and it could be like a sea, in Revelation. It could be a sea of ice. But he sees something above the angels, like awe-inspiring crystals spread out above their heads. And under the expanse, their wings were stretched out straight, one toward another, and each creature had 2 wings covering its body. And so, from this and from the book of Revelation, we get the picture that their wings serve as a kind of pedestal for this expanse. Like the legs on a coffee table, right? And so their wings, they spread out, 4 of them, and this expanse is resting upon the tips of their wings. So they become the pedestal they're holding up this great expanse of crystal, whatever that is. Verse 24, and when they went, so in their motion, I heard the sound of their wings, like the sound of many waters, like the sound of the Almighty, a sound of tumult, like the sound of an army. And when they stood still, they let down their wings. The description here, how many of you have ever gone to Niagara Falls or taken, the Maid of the Mist down to the falls? Anybody do that? A couple of people. I know that when my girls were little, Bev and I were on vacation. We took them to Niagara Falls, and we got on that boat, the Maid of the Mist, and it takes you right down to the bottom of the falls. And I remember going and thinking, number one, this is getting very loud, but number two, he's getting pretty close. Is he paying attention here? Because here it comes, and it's like thunder and lightning and the roaring of a jet engine. It's so loud. Well, he says that it's the flapping of their wings is like the sound of many waters, like the sound of the Almighty himself, the sound of a tumult, the sound like an army is coming. Loud, thunderous sound. Where's it coming from? It's coming from their wings. Now, most say that it's not that they're flapping their wings to fly, but they are just moving their wings to make this great sound, like a waterfall, like an army, to signify the greatness and the majesty of the throne of God. As they move, they flutter their wings to make this great sound because, as it were, God is on the move. so that when they stop, they let down their wings. So they move, they flutter their wings to make this great sound, but when they stop, they just lower their wings. And there came a voice from above the expanse over their heads, so that when they stood, they let down their wings. And above the expanse, over their heads, there was the likeness of a throne, in appearance like sapphire, bright and brilliant. And seated above the likeness of a throne was a likeness with a human appearance. So what is he seeing? In his vision, he's seeing the throne of God. So above these angels, as it were resting upon the tip of their wings, there's this great expanse of crystal, whether it's bowl-like or flat, whether it's gleaming like jewel-like or like ice. We don't really know exactly, because it's kind of like this, kind of like that. But then above that is a throne. And seated on the throne is someone who has the appearance of a man, kind of man-like in his appearance. And upward from what had the appearance of his waist, I saw as it were gleaming metal, like the appearance of fire enclosed all around. Once again, we have this picture of glowing metal. So his torso, from his waist up, it was just this bright, brilliant gleam like metal, fire. The gleaming metal like the appearance of fire enclosed all around. So you're trying to get that mental image, and you've probably seen this before, you've read this before, but from his waist up, it's just this like red-hot glowing metal. And downward from what had the appearance of his waist, I saw as it were the appearance of fire, and there was brightness around him. So even from his waist down, it was like fire, like the appearance of the bow that is in the cloud on the day of rain, so was the appearance of the brightness all around. What is that? So his torso looked like the torso of a man, like red-hot metal. It glowed, was brilliant. And from his waist down, it was the appearance of fire. There was great brightness around him. And there was there the appearance of a bow, like a Noah's day, right? He saw a rainbow. We see this in Revelation chapter 4 as well. So there's a lot of similarities. We're not taking the time, but you can go read Revelation 4, see a lot of similarities between that vision and Ezekiel's vision. And so here he sees a rainbow. What is a rainbow a symbol of? Of God's promise. It becomes a symbol of hope. Because in the midst of this brilliant, fire-like being who is coming in judgment, there is a bow. There is hope. Now this is important because God is coming in judgment, isn't he? But he's also coming to restore. There's the hope of restoration. And so he just says, and such was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. And when I saw it, I fell on my face, and I heard the voice of one speaking. And we'll stop there. But he began by telling us that this was about the glory of God. And here he ends by saying, and this is the likeness of the glory of the Lord. That's what this vision is all about, isn't it? That he might get a sense of the glory of God. Strange, yes. Unique, yes. Terrifying, probably, right? He falls down. He's overcome. And probably with a sense of reverence and awe and fear and humility, he falls down before the glory of the Lord. Strange vision, isn't it? But Ezekiel needs this vision before he begins fulfilling his office as a prophet. He needs this vision of the glory of God. God is going to ask him to do some difficult things. See, even strange things. Are they going to listen? No. But that doesn't matter, does it? But Ezekiel needs to see the glory of the Lord before he begins fulfilling his calling. He needs to see God's glory. I mean, that's something we all need, isn't it? Even today, as we think about serving the Lord, it helps to have a vision of his glory. You know, the people of the people of Israel, and this, of course, as I said last week, this is Judah, but Ezekiel calls them Israel. They're people who have introduced false worship into the worship of the Holy One. I would say that this kind of gets ahead of myself a little bit, but if you want to summarize the sins of God's people, whether it was the 10 tribes who are now gone or the 2 tribes who are here, the major sin of these people for which they're being judged is the sin of idolatry. You may remember, it's been a long time, when I was preaching through 1 Corinthians, we got to chapter 10, and I said that the worst accusation that could be made against a person from the Scripture is to be called an idolater. That's the worst thing you can call a person. What? In the 10 Commandments, thou shalt have no other gods before me. That's it. That's number 1. Don't bring any other false gods into my presence. That's the worst thing you could do. And that's exactly what Israel was doing. Over and over and over again. They introduced the worship of idols, of pagan gods, into the worship of Yahweh. They were guilty of syncretism. They were trying to blend the worship and the worship practices and the worship of idols and bringing it into the worship of God. So they went to the point, to the extreme of, it's described here for us later on. They faced a certain direction to worship the sun. As if that wasn't bad enough, they actually brought idols into the temple, into the Holy of Holies. They brought idols, thinking they could worship both, to appease both. So, I'm safe this way, I'm safe that way. The very thing that God hated. Don't do that. And they did it. And so judgment is coming. But Ezekiel needs to see the glory of God first. Get a vision of him. And remember, I said one of the themes, and one of the repeated words anyway, is that they might know, right? You've got to know God. You got to know what God is like. They this whole vision thing and the coming judgment is so that they would know who he is and what he is like. And it begins here, getting a vision of the glory of God. And I know that my words, it's kind of like, Ezekiel say, well, it's kind of like this, kind of like that, trying to get an understanding of all of this, but it is a picture of the glory of God, the glorious God, sitting high in the heavens, ruling over the earth. And so out of this vision, let me just quickly, in just a minute or two, let me make some application. This is the first one, and this is a theme that we looked at last week. God is not like us. Can you read and think about and meditate on this vision and say that God is anything like us? No. He's not like us. God is other, right? God is other. He's not like us. God is holy. It's another thing. God is holy. We see this in his glory. We see this in certain actions and certain parts of the vision, like the angels who cover their bodies with two of their wings because of the holiness of God. God is holy. God is omnipresent and omniscient, isn't he? He's omnipresent. Like lightning, flashing. God is here, God is there, God is everywhere. And he sees everything. He is all-knowing. He's not like us. He is holy. He is omniscient. He is omnipresent. God is glorious. God is glorious. God is merciful. For one thing, God is speaking, isn't he? God is speaking beforehand. God has warned them over and over and over, hasn't he? And even in this vision, there is a ray of hope. There is a ray of mercy seen in the bow. Judgment is coming, but there is also hope. And it's the mercy of God that he disciplines us and corrects us. God judges. We see this in the vision. The stormy wind, the lightning, great cloud coming from the north. God is coming to judge. And that's, the first 28 chapters or 24 chapters, whatever it is. It's all about judgment, isn't it? He's coming to judge. So, those are some observations, some things that we can take away. God is not like us. He is holy. He's omnipresent. He's omniscient. He's glorious. He's merciful. He judges. And just another thought. God is sovereign. God is sovereign. There's no one like him. He sits upon the throne. And he sits over everything and everyone, doesn't he? This great expanse in the heavens, as God sits on the throne, he's the sovereign God of the universe, of every creature, of everything. And some, as they describe the appearance of the Lord, the wheel, within a wheel, the eyes, the way that it turns or the way that it goes, how tall, how awesome it is. They say that this is a kind of a verbal description of the providence of God. What is the providence of God? Well, basically it's God's sovereignty in action, accomplishing his purposes in all of his creation. Making sure that everything gets to its ordained end. The providence of God. And we see the providence of God in motion, in action here. As God exercises his sovereignty. Moving, acting, knowing, being. It's just all the providence of God as he exercises his sovereignty. So, this is where it all begins, with this strange vision, but it's really, I don't think, that hard to understand, is it? It's just going through it piece by piece and saying, well, this is what this represents, and this is what this represents, and in the end, it's all about seeing the glory of God. And if you just meditate on this, he is glorious. Brilliant, like coals of fire, like flashing lightning, like crystal, just brilliant, glorious God, seated on his throne. All right. Any questions or comments?